The great army which the emperor was about to set in motion against Austria now had its back to that empire, since the forces deployed on the coasts of the North Sea, the Channel, and the Atlantic were facing England. On the right wing, the First Corps, commanded by Bernadotte, occupied Hanover. The second, under the orders of Marmont, was in Holland. The third, under Davout, was in Bruges. The fourth, fifth, and sixth, commanded by Soult, Lannes, and Ney, were encamped at Boulogne and in the surrounding district, while, finally, the seventh, commanded by Augereau, was in Brest and formed the extreme left. To break up this long cordon of troops and form them into a large body which could march toward Austria, it was necessary to effect an immense turnaround from front to back. Each army had to make an about turn in order to face Germany and form columns to march there by the shortest route. Thus, the right wing became the left, and the left the right. Obviously, to go from Hanover or Holland to the Danube, the First and Second Corps had a much shorter distance to travel than those who came from Boulogne, and they, in turn, were nearer than Augereau's corps, which, in order to go from Brest to the frontiers of Switzerland on the Upper Rhine, had to cross the whole of France, a journey of some 300 leagues. The troops were on the road for 2 months, marching in several columns. Marshal Augereau was the last to leave Brest, but he then went on ahead and stopped first at Rennes and then successively at Alençon, Melun, Troyes, and Langres, at which stops he inspected the various regiments, whose morale was raised by his presence. The weather was superb. I spent the 2 months travelling endlessly in an open carriage from one column to another, carrying the marshal's orders to the generals, and was able to stop twice at Paris to see my mother. Our equipment had gone on in advance. I had a mediocre servant, but 3 excellent horses. While the Grande Armée was wending its way towards the Rhine and the Danube, the French troops stationed in northern Italy, under the command of Masséna, concentrated in the Milan area in order to attack the Austrians in the region of Venice. To transmit his orders to Masséna, the emperor was obliged to send his aides-de-camp through Switzerland, which remained neutral. Now it so happened that while Marshal Augereau was at Langres, an officer who was carrying Napoleon's dispatches was thrown out of his carriage and broke his collarbone. He was taken to Marshal Augereau, whom he told that he was unable to continue his mission. The marshal, knowing how important it was that the emperor's dispatches should arrive in Italy without delay, entrusted me with the task of delivering them, and also of going through Huningue, where I was to pass on his order to have a bridge built over the Rhine at this spot. I was delighted to have this mission, as it meant that I would have an interesting journey, and would be sure of rejoining 7th Corps before they were in action against the Austrians. It did not take me long to reach Huningue and Basel. I went from there to Berne and on to Rapperswil, where I left my carriage. Then, on horseback, and not without some danger, I crossed the Splugen Pass, at that time almost impracticable. I entered Italy at Chiavenna and joined Marshal Masséna near Verona. I went off again without any delay, for Masséna was as impatient to see me go with his replies to the emperor as I was to rejoin Marshal Augereau before there was any fighting. However, my return journey was not as rapid as my journey out, because a very heavy fall of snow had covered not only the mountains, but also the valleys of Switzerland. It had begun to freeze hard, and horses slipped and fell at every step. It was only by offering 600 francs that I was able to find 2 guides who were prepared to cross the Splugen with me. It took us more than 12 hours to make the crossing, walking through snow sometimes up to our knees. The guides were on the point of refusing to go any further, saying that it was too dangerous, but I was young and venturesome, and I knew the importance of the dispatches which the emperor was awaiting. I told my guides that, even if they turned back, I would go on without them. Every profession has its code of honor. That of the guides consists principally in never abandoning the traveler committed to their care. Mine then went forward, and after some truly extraordinary exertions, we arrived at the large inn situated at the foot of the Splugen as night was falling. We would undoubtedly have died if we had been trapped on the mountain, for the path, which was barely discernible, was edged by precipices which the snow prevented us from seeing clearly. I was exhausted, but a sleep restored my strength, so I left at daybreak to reach Rapperswil, where there were carriages and passable roads. The worst of the journey was over. So, in spite of the snow and bitter cold, I reached Basel and then Huninge, where the 7th Corps was stationed, on the 19th of October. The next day we began to cross the Rhine over a bridge of boats, built for that purpose. For although there was, less than half a league away in the town of Basel, a stone bridge, the Emperor had ordered Marshal Augereau to respect the neutrality of Switzerland. A neutrality which they themselves broke 9 years later by handing the bridge to the enemies of France in 1814. Here I was then, involved once more in a war. It was now 1805, a year which for me heralded a long series of battles which lasted continuously for 10 years, for it did not end until 10 years later at Waterloo. However numerous the wars of the Empire might be, nearly all French soldiers enjoyed 1 or even several years of respite, either because they were in a garrison in France, or they were stationed in Italy or Germany when we were at war with Spain. But, as you will see, this did not happen to me. I was continually sent from north to south, and south to north, everywhere where there was fighting. I did not spend a single one of these 10 years without coming under fire, and without shedding my blood in some foreign country. I do not intend to give, here, a detailed account of the campaign of 1805. I shall limit myself to recalling the principal events. The Russians, who were marching to the aid of Austria, were still far away, when Field Marshal Mack, at the head of 80,000 men, advanced, unwisely, into Bavaria, where he was defeated by Napoleon, who forced him to retreat to the fortress of Ulm, where he surrendered with the greater part of his army, of which only 2 corps escaped the disaster. One of these, commanded by Prince Ferdinand, managed to reach Bohemia. The other, commanded by the elderly Field Marshal Jellicoe, escaped into the Vorarlberg near Lake Constance, where, flanked by neutral Switzerland, it guarded the narrow passes of the Black Forest. It was these troops which Marshal Augereau was about to attack. After crossing the Rhine at Huninge, 7th Corps found itself in the country of Baden, whose sovereign, along with those of Bavaria and Württemberg, had just concluded an alliance with Napoleon. So we were received as friends by the population of Brisgau. Field Marshal Jellicoe had not dared to oppose the French in such open country, but awaited us beyond Freiburg, at the entrance to the Black Forest, the passage through which he expected us to effect only at the cost of much bloodshed. Above all, he hoped to stop us at the Val d'Enfer, a very long and narrow pass, dominated on both sides by sheer cliffs and easy to defend. But the men of 7th Corps had now heard of the successes achieved by their comrades at Ulm and in Bavaria, and, anxious to emulate them, they advanced through the Black Forest with such elan that they crossed through it in 3 days, in spite of the natural obstacles, the enemy resistance, and the difficulty in finding food in this dreadful wilderness. The army finally broke out into fertile country and made camp around Donaueschingen, a very pleasant town where there is the magnificent chateau of the ancient line of the princes of Fürstenberg. The marshal and his aides-de-camp were billeted in the chateau, in the courtyard of which is the source of the Danube. This great river demonstrates its power at the moment of its birth, for, at the spot where it issues from the earth, it already bears a boat. The draft horses for the guns and the supply wagons had been greatly fatigued by the passage through the rough and mountainous passes of the Black Forest, which a coating of frost had made even more difficult. It was therefore necessary to give them several days of rest, during which period the Austrian cavalry came, from time to time, to probe our outposts, which were positioned 2 leagues from the town. But this amounted to no more than some ineffectual fire which kept us on our toes, gave us some exercise in skirmishing, and allowed us to learn to recognize the various uniforms of the enemy. I saw, for the first time, the Uhlans of Prince Charles, Rosenberg's dragoons, and Blankenstein's hussars, the horses having recovered their strength, the army continued its march, and for several weeks we had a series of engagements which left us masters of Engen and Stockach. Although I was very much involved in these various actions, I had only one accident, which, however, might have been serious. The ground was covered by snow, particularly round Stockach, where the enemy defended their position fiercely. The marshal ordered me to go and reconnoitre a spot to which he wanted to direct a column. I left at the gallop. The ground looked to me to be quite level, the snow, driven by the wind, having hidden all the hollows, but suddenly my horse and I fell into a deep gully up to our necks in snow. I was trying to get out, when 2 enemy hussars appeared at the edge and fired their muskets at me. Fortunately, the snow in which my horse and I were floundering prevented them from taking an accurate aim, and I came to no harm. But they were about to fire once more when some chasseurs, whom Marshal Augereau had sent to my aid, forced them to depart hurriedly. With some help, I was able to get out of the ravine, but we had a great deal of difficulty in extricating my horse. As we were both unhurt, my comrades had a laugh at the strange appearance I presented after my bath of snow. After we had gained control of the Vorarlberg, we captured Bregenz and drove Jellekic's Austrian corps to Lake Constance and the Tyrol. The enemy now sought the protection of the fortress of Feldkirch and its celebrated gorge, behind which they could defend themselves with advantage. We expected to have to fight a murderous battle to take this position when, to our astonishment, the Austrians offered to capitulate, an offer which Marshal Augereau was quick to accept. During the meeting between the 2 marshals, the Austrian officers, humiliated by the reverse which their arms had just suffered, took malicious pleasure in giving us some very bad news which had been concealed up till this day, but which the Russians and Austrians had learned of from English sources. The Franco-Spanish fleet had been defeated by Lord Nelson on October 20th, not far from Cadiz, at Cape Trafalgar. Villeneuve, our infelicitous admiral, who had failed to carry out the precise orders of Napoleon, at a time when the appearance of a combined fleet in the Channel could have secured a safe passage for the troops assembled at Boulogne, learning that he was about to be replaced by Admiral Roselli, passed suddenly from an excess of circumspection to an excess of audacity. He left Cadiz and engaged in a battle which, had it turned out in our favour, would have been virtually useless, since the French army, instead of being at Boulogne, to take advantage of such a success to embark for England, was 200 leagues from the coast, fighting in Germany. After a most desperate struggle, the fleets of France and Spain had been defeated by that of England, whose admiral, the famous Nelson, had been killed, taking to his grave a reputation as the finest seaman of the epoch. On our side, we lost Rear Admiral Magon, a very fine officer. One of our vessels blew up. 17, as many French as Spanish, were captured. A severe storm which arose toward the end of the battle lasted all night and the days following, and was on the verge of overwhelming both victors and vanquished, so that the English, concerned for their own safety, were forced to abandon nearly all the ships which they had captured from us. These were mostly taken back to Cadiz by the remains of their brave but unfortunate crews, though some were wrecked on the rock-bound coast. It was during this battle that my excellent friend, Franz D'Houdetot, received a wound to his thigh, which has left him with a limp. D'Houdetot, scarcely out of childhood, was a naval cadet and attached to the staff of Admiral Magon, a friend of my father. After the death of the admiral, the ship Algeciras, in which he served, was captured after a bloody encounter, and the English placed on board a prize crew of 60 men. But the storm separated the ship from the English fleet, and the prize crew realized that it was very unlikely that they could reach England, so they agreed to allow the French seamen to take the ship into Cadiz, with the stipulation that they would not be held as prisoners of war. The French flag was hoisted to identify the ship, and the badly damaged vessel managed to reach Cadiz, though not without great difficulty. The ship which bore Admiral Villeneuve was captured, and the unlucky admiral was taken to England, where he remained a prisoner for 3 years. Having been released on exchange, he decided to go to Paris, but, detained at Rennes, he committed suicide. When Field Marshal Jellachich felt obliged to capitulate before the 7th French Army Corps, this decision seemed the more surprising since, even if defeated by us, he had the option of retiring into the Tyrol, which was behind him, and whose inhabitants have, for many centuries, been greatly attached to the House of Austria. The thick snow which covered the country no doubt made movement difficult, but the difficulties presented would have been much greater for us, enemies of Austria, than for the troops of Jellachich, withdrawing through an Austrian province. However, if the old and hidebound field marshal could not bring himself to campaign in winter, in the high mountains his attitude was not shared by the officers under his command, for many of them condemned his pusillanimity and spoke of rebelling against his authority. The most ardent of his opponents was General the Prince de Rohan, a French officer in the service of Austria, a bold and competent soldier. Marshal Augereau, fearing that Jellachich might take the advice offered by the prince and retreat into the Tyrol where pursuit would be almost impossible, hastened to grant him all the conditions which he requested. The terms of the capitulation were that the Austrian troops should lay down their arms, hand over their flags, standards, cannons, and horses, but should not themselves be taken to France, and could withdraw to Bohemia after swearing not to bear arms against France for 1 year. When he announced the capitulation in one of his army bulletins, the emperor seemed a little disappointed that the Austrian soldiers had not been made prisoners of war, but he changed his mind when he realized that Marshal Augereau had no means of retaining them, as escape was so easy. In fact, during the night preceding the day when the Austrians were to lay down their arms, a revolt broke out in several brigades against Field Marshal Jellachich. The Prince de Rohan, refusing to accept the capitulation, left with his infantry division, and, joined by some regiments from other divisions, fled into the mountains, which he crossed despite the rigors of the season. Then, by an audacious march, he bypassed the cantonments of Marshal Ney's troops, who occupied the towns of the Tyrol, and, arriving between Verona and Venice, he fell on the rear of the French army of Italy, while this force, commanded by Masséna, was following on the tail of Prince Charles, who was retiring towards Friuli. The arrival of the Prince de Rohan in Venetian territory, when Masséna was already in the far distance, could have had the most grave consequences. But fortunately, a French army, coming from Naples, under the command of General Saint-Cyr, defeated the prince and took him prisoner. He had, at least, submitted only to force, and was right in saying that, if Jellachich had been there with all his troops, the Austrians might have defeated Saint-Cyr and opened a route for themselves back into Austria. When a force capitulates, it is customary for the victor to send to each division a staff officer to take charge, as it were, and to conduct it, on the day and at the hour appointed, to the place where it is to lay down its arms. Those of my comrades who were sent to the Prince de Rohan were left behind by him in the camp which he quitted, for he carried out his retreat from an area behind the fortress of Feldkirch, and in a direction away from the French camp, so that he had little fear of being stopped. But the Austrian cavalry were not in a similar situation. They were in bivouac on a small area of open ground in front of Feldkirch, and opposite, and a short distance from, our outposts. I had been detailed to go to the Austrian cavalry and lead them to the agreed rendezvous. This brigade did not have a general, but was commanded by a colonel of Blankenstein's Hussars, an elderly Hungarian, brave and crafty, whose name, I regret, I cannot remember, for I think highly of him, although he played me a most disagreeable trick. On my arrival at the camp, the colonel had offered me the hospitality of his hut for the night, and we had agreed to set off at daybreak, to reach the spot indicated on the shore of Lake Constance, between the town of Bregenz and Lindau, at a distance of about 3 leagues. I was most astonished when, at about midnight, I heard the officers mounting their horses. I hurried out of the hut and saw that the squadrons were formed up and ready to move. I asked the reason for this hasty departure, and the old colonel replied, with cool deceit, that Field Marshal Jellachich feared that some jeering directed at the Austrian soldiers by the French, whose camp one would have to pass if one took the shortest route to the beach at Lindau, might lead to fighting between the troops of the two nations. Jelačić, in consultation with Marshal Augereau, had ordered the Austrian troops to make a long detour to the right so that they would avoid our camp and the town of Bregenz, and would not come into contact with our soldiers. He added that, as the route was very long and the road bad, the two commanders had advanced the time of departure by some hours. He was surprised that I had not been informed of this, but suggested that the written instructions had been held up at the advance posts, owing to some misunderstanding. He carried this deception so far as to send an officer to look for this dispatch wherever it might be. The explanation given by the colonel of the Blankensteins sounded so convincing that I did not say anything, although my instinct told me that this was a little irregular. But, alone in the midst of 3,000 enemy cavalry, what could I do? It was better to appear confident than to seem to doubt the good faith of the Austrian brigade. As I was unaware of the flight of the Prince de Rohan's division, it did not enter my head that the commander of the cavalry intended to evade the capitulation. I rode alongside him at the head of the column. The Austrian had made his arrangements for the avoidance of the French camps, whose fires could be seen, so well that we did not pass near any of them. But what the old colonel had not anticipated, and was unable to avoid, was an encounter with a flying patrol, which the French cavalry usually sent out into the countryside at night, some distance from an encampment. For suddenly there was a challenge, and we found ourselves in the presence of a large column of French cavalry, which was clearly visible in the moonlight. The Hungarian colonel, without seeming the least worried, said to me, "This is work for you, as an aide-de-camp. Kindly come with me and explain the situation to the commander of this French unit." We went forward. I gave the password, and found myself in the presence of the 7th Mounted Chasseurs, who, knowing that the Austrian troops were expected for the laying down of arms, and recognizing me as one of Marshal Augereau's aides, made no difficulty about the passage of the brigade which I was conducting. The French commander, whose troops had their sabres drawn, even took the trouble to have them sheathed, as witness to the goodwill existing between the two columns, which went on their way for some distance, side by side. I closely questioned the officer in charge of the chasseurs about the change in the time at which the Austrians were to move, but he knew nothing at all about it, something which did not raise any suspicion in my mind, for I knew that an order of this kind would not be distributed by the staff down to regimental level. So I continued to ride with the colonel for the rest of the night, finding, however, that the detour we were making was very long and the going very bad. At last, at daybreak, the old colonel, seeing a patch of level ground, said to me, in a conversational tone of voice, that although he would soon be obliged to hand over the horses of the 3 regiments to the French, he wished to care for the poor animals up to the last, and to deliver them in good condition. In consequence, he had ordered that they should be given a feed of oats. The brigade halted, formed up, and dismounted, and when the horses had been tethered, the colonel, who alone remained on horseback, gathered in a circle around him the officers and men of the 3 regiments, and, in a ringing voice which made the old warrior seem quite superb, he announced that the Prince de Rohan's division, preferring honor to a shameful safety, had refused to subscribe to the disgraceful capitulation whereby Field Marshal Jelačić had promised to hand over to the French the flags and the arms of the Austrian troops, and had fled into the Tyrol, where he too would have led the brigade, were it not for the fact that he feared that, in that barren mountain country, there would not be enough fodder for so many horses. But now they had open country in front of them, and having, by a ruse of which he was proud, gained a lead of 6 leagues over the French troops, he invited all those who had truly Austrian hearts to follow him across Germany to Moravia, where they could rejoin the army of their august sovereign, Francis II. Blankenstein's Hussars responded to this speech by their colonel with a resounding cheer of approval. But Rosenberg's dragoons and the Uhlans of Prince Charles maintained a gloomy silence. As for me, although I did not yet know enough German to follow the colonel's words exactly, what I did understand together with the tone of the orator and the position in which he found himself, allowed me to guess what was afoot, and I can promise you that I felt very crestfallen at having, although unwittingly, furthered the plans of this diabolical Hungarian. A fearful tumult now arose in the immense circle by which I was surrounded, and I was able to appreciate the inconvenience stemming from the heterogeneous amalgamation of different peoples which makes up the Austrian Empire and, in consequence, the Austrian army. All the Hussars were Hungarian. The Blankensteins therefore approved the proposal made by a leader of their own nationality, but the dragoons were German and the Uhlans were Polish. The Hungarian could make no nationalistic appeal to them, who, in this difficult situation, listened only to their own officers. These officers declared that they thought themselves bound by the capitulation which Field Marshal Jelicic had signed, and did not wish, by their departure, to worsen his position or that of their comrades who were already in the hands of the French, who would be within their rights to send them all back to France as prisoners of war if a part of the Austrian forces violated the agreement. To this the colonel replied that, when the commander-in-chief of an army loses his head, fails in his duty, and delivers his troops to the enemy, his juniors have no need to consult anything but their courage and their devotion to their country. Then the colonel, brandishing his sabre in one hand, while with the other he seized the regimental standard, cried out, "Go then, dragoons, go, go, yield to the French your dishonored standards and the arms which the Emperor gave us for his defense. As for us, the bold Hussars, we are off to rejoin our sovereign, to whom we can once more show with honor our unstained colors and the swords of fearless soldiers." Then, drawing close to me, and casting a look of disdain on the Uhlans and dragoons, he added, "I am sure that if this young Frenchman found himself in our position, and had to choose between your conduct and mine, he would take the more courageous course, for the French love honor and reputation as much as their country." Having said this, the old Hungarian sheathed his sabre, dug in his spurs, and, leading his regiment at the gallop, he careered into the distance, where he soon disappeared. There was some truth in both the arguments which I had heard, but that of the old Hungarian seemed the more valid because it was in conformity with the interests of his country. I then secretly approved of his behavior, but I could not, of course, advise the dragoons and Uhlans to follow his example. That would have been to step out of my role and fail in my duty. I maintained a strict neutrality in this discussion, and when the Hussars had left, I asked the colonels of the other two regiments to follow me, and we took the road for Lindau. On the beach beside the lake, we found Marshals Augereau and Jelicic, as well as the French forces and the Austrian infantry regiments which had not followed the Prince de Rohan. On learning from me that the Blankenstein Hussars, having refused to recognize the capitulation, were heading for Moravia, both marshals flew into a rage. Marshal Augereau, because he feared that these Hussars might cause havoc in the rear of the French army, since the route which they would follow would take them through areas where the Emperor, in the course of his march on Vienna, had left many dressing stations full of wounded, artillery parks, etc. But the Hungarian colonel did not think it was part of his duty to advertise his presence by any surprise attack, as he was only too anxious to get out of a country bristling with French arms. By avoiding all our positions, moving always on minor roads, hiding by day in the woods and marching rapidly at night, he managed to reach the frontier of Moravia without trouble and joined an Austrian army corps which occupied the area. As for the troops who remained with Field Marshal Jelicic, having laid down their arms, surrendered their flags and standards, and handed over their horses, they became prisoners on parole for 1 year, and made off, in dismal silence, for the interior of Germany, to make their way sadly to Bohemia. I remembered, when I saw them, the valiant words of the old colonel, and I think I saw on the faces of many of these Uhlans and dragoons a regret that they had not followed the old warrior, and an unhappiness when they compared the heroic position of the Blankensteins with their own humiliation. Among the trophies which Jelicic's corps was forced to hand over were 17 flags and 2 standards, which Marshal Augereau, as was usual, hastened to send to the Emperor in the care of 2 aides de camp. Major Massy and I were detailed for this task, and we left the same evening in a fine carriage with, in front of us, a wagon containing the flags and standards in the charge of a non-commissioned officer. We headed for Vienna via Kempten, Braunau, Munich, Linz, and St. Pölten. Some leagues before this last town, following the banks of the Danube, we admired the superb Abbey of Melk, one of the richest in the world. It was here, 4 years later, that I ran the greatest danger and earned the praise of the Emperor for having performed, before his eyes, the finest feat of arms of my military career, as you will see when we come to the campaign of 1809. That concludes the 17th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.